Snowy mountains of the American Wild West, somewhere around the late 1800s. The wind moves through tall pine trees, carrying the smell of cold earth and wood smoke. Far away, a lone cabin stands on a quiet mountain slope where winter seems to last longer than anywhere else. This story follows Coulter Briggs, a 40-year-old mountain trapper known across the frontier as a man as tough and silent as the peaks he lives among. People in nearby towns say the mountains carved the warmth out of his heart long ago. But one winter day, a traveler arrives, Lydia, a 27-year-old woman who has crossed half the frontier searching for him. She claims Coulter once saved her life during a deadly snowstorm years ago. What Coulter doesn't know yet is that Lydia didn't come back only to say thank you. She came because sometimes a single act of kindness can echo across years and turn the coldest winter into the beginning of a love story. Snow fell like quiet ash from a sky the color of old iron. The mountains stood tall and patient around the valley, their white shoulders glowing faintly beneath the dim winter sun. Pine trees whispered as the wind passed through them, carrying the smell of resin and cold stone. Somewhere far off a crow cried, its voice thin against the endless wilderness. If a man stood still long enough out here, he could hear the earth breathing beneath the snow. And if he listened even longer, he might hear the stories the mountains kept hidden. I have lived beside these ridges longer than most men care to count. Long enough to see towns rise like hopeful seedlings and vanish just as quietly. Long enough to watch the seasons carve men into something harder, quieter, lonelier. Some stories arrive like thunder, full of gunfire and dust. But this one began softly, with winter pressing its slow hand against the door of a lonely cabin. That cabin belonged to a man named Coulter Briggs. The first thing people noticed about Coulter was his silence. The second was the way the cold seemed to respect him. On that morning, he stood outside the cabin splitting logs, his broad shoulders bare despite the bitter air. Steam curled from his skin as the axe fell again and again into stubborn pine. Each strike echoed across the slope like a steady heartbeat. Coulter was 40 years old, though the mountains had etched deeper lines across his face. His beard held flecks of frost. A pale scar traced the curve of his ribs, a memory from some forgotten winter fight. Yet there was strength in him still, the kind that did not boast or shout, the kind that simply endured. When the last log cracked open, he paused and looked toward the distant valley. A thread of smoke rose from the town of Ridge below, twisting into the gray sky. Supplies were running low, and even mountain men needed flour and salt now and then. So Coulter saddled his horse and began the slow descent through the snowy trails. The ride to town was quiet except for the soft crunch of hooves and the distant groan of frozen branches. By the time he reached the main street, the sun had climbed a little higher, painting the wooden buildings in pale gold. Ridge was small but stubborn, a trading post, a saloon, a blacksmith shop that rang with steady hammer blows. Men looked up as Coulter rode in. Some tipped their hats with quiet respect. Others simply watched the way folks watch a passing storm. Old Jasper Pike leaned against the porch of his trading post, his wooden leg planted firm in the snow. Age had thinned his hair, but not his voice. Well now, if it ain't the ghost of the mountain himself. Coulter swung down from the saddle and brushed frost from his coat. "Morning, Jasper." The old man grinned as he handed over a sack of flour. "Heard folks saying winter, going to bite hard this year. Good thing you're half bare already." Coulter gave a faint smile, the kind that appeared rarely and vanished quickly. Inside the post office, the warmth of the stove wrapped around him like a memory. A few townsfolk lingered near the counter. Among them stood Ruth, her dark hair tucked beneath a wool shawl. She watched Coulter with a mix of amusement and concern. "One of these days you ought to stop living like a wandering ghost," she said gently. "Man your age deserves a warm table and someone waiting by the fire." Coulter tied the flour sack to his saddle before answering. "Some men earn that kind of peace." His voice was calm, steady as falling snow. "Others are better off staying where the mountains can keep an eye on them." Ruth studied him for a moment, as if searching for the younger man he had once been, but whatever she hoped to see remained buried beneath years of silence. The sound of rattling wheels interrupted the street. A stagecoach rolled slowly into town, its wooden frame groaning beneath frost. Travelers were rare in winter. People stepped outside their shops to watch. The door opened. A woman stepped down carefully into the snow. She wore a long dark coat dusted with white flakes, and the wind tugged loose strands of chestnut hair across her face. She was young, perhaps 27, but her eyes held the steady calm of someone who had already walked through difficult seasons. She carried only a single leather satchel. Old Jasper tilted his head. Strange time of year to be arriving anywhere. The woman glanced around the street until her gaze landed on Coulter Briggs. For a moment, neither of them moved. Coulter felt the faintest stir of recognition, though he could not place it, just a flicker, like a half-remembered dream. The woman approached slowly, boots pressing soft tracks into the snow. Her voice was quiet but clear. "Are you Coulter Briggs?" Coulter nodded once. "That depends on who's asking." She studied his face as though confirming something written long ago. "My name is Lydia." The name meant nothing to him. "I traveled a long way to find you." Coulter rested his hand on the saddle horn, already sensing trouble in the air. People sometimes came looking for mountain men, usually for traps, sometimes for trouble. "You've got the wrong man if you're looking for company," he said. A faint smile touched Lydia's lips, though her eyes held something deeper. "No, Mr. Briggs, I'm certain I found the right one." Snow drifted between them, slow and silent. Coulter shook his head. "I'm too old for whatever story you're chasing." He turned toward his horse, ready to leave the moment behind. But Lydia spoke again, softer this time. "You once saved a girl from freezing to death in the mountains." Coulter stopped. The wind seemed to pause with him, and Lydia's next words fell into the silence like a stone into deep water. "That girl was me." The words hung in the winter air between them, fragile as frost. For a long moment Coulter Briggs said nothing. Snow settled on the brim of his hat and along the shoulders of his coat, but he did not brush it away. Lydia stood across from him, steady despite the cold, her eyes holding that same quiet certainty that had stopped him in his tracks. Town sounds drifted around them, boots on wooden boards, a hammer ringing faintly from the blacksmith's shed, the creak of the stagecoach preparing to leave again. Yet the world seemed to narrow to that single memory she had spoken aloud. Coulter finally looked away. "Lots of girls pass through these mountains," he said slowly. "Hard winters make people remember things that never happened." Lydia did not argue. She simply opened the leather satchel at her side and drew out a small object wrapped in cloth. When she unfolded it, the dull silver of an old compass caught the gray light. The needle inside trembled faintly. "You left this with me," she said it might help me find the road again when the snow cleared. Coulter stared at the compass as if it were a ghost, his jaw tightened. After a moment, he closed her hand gently around it. "Keep it," he murmured. "Whoever helped you meant for you too." And with that, he swung into his saddle. The horse snorted clouds of breath into the cold. Coulter gave the reins a soft pull and rode toward the edge of town, leaving Lydia standing beside the quiet street. By the time the pine ridges swallowed him again, the sky had darkened with another storm. The mountain trail climbed through forests heavy with snow. Branches sagged low, whispering against Coulter's coat as he passed. Wind curled through the ravines like a restless spirit. He rode in silence, though Lydia's words followed him like echoes. "You once saved a girl from freezing to death." He had not expected the past to ride back into his life on a winter coach. When the cabin finally appeared through the trees, dusk had settled over the mountains. Smoke rose faintly from the stone chimney where the morning fire still breathed. Coulter unsaddled his horse and began splitting more wood beneath the fading light. The steady rhythm of the axe helped quiet his thoughts. Night came quickly in winter. The stars sharpened above the dark pines. Wolves howled somewhere deep in the valley, their voices rising and falling like wind through hollow bones. Coulter had just stepped inside the cabin when he heard it. The distant clatter of hooves on frozen ground. He opened the door again, the lamplight spilling across the snow. A horse stood at the edge of the clearing, its sides heaving with breath. Lydia slid down from the saddle. For a heartbeat, Coulter simply stared. The ride up here was not easy even for seasoned men. Snow drifted deep along the narrow trail, and the cold could break a careless traveler before nightfall. Yet she had followed him anyway. "You shouldn't be here," he said quietly. Lydia looped the reins around a branch and stepped toward the cabin. Neither should you, she answered. The wind lifted the edge of her coat, frost clung to her boots, and exhaustion shadowed her face, but she stood straight. Coulter stepped aside. The warmth inside the cabin wrapped around them both as the door closed. The room was simple, one sturdy table, a narrow bed, shelves stacked with traps and tools polished by years of use. A small fire burned in the stone hearth, painting the log walls with golden light. Lydia removed her gloves slowly, holding them near the flames. The silence stretched between them again. Finally, Coulter spoke. You rode half a mountain in winter, just to prove a story true. Her gaze remained fixed on the fire. I rode because some debts are heavier than snow. Coulter leaned against the wall, arms folded. And you believe I'm the man who carried you through that storm. I know you are. He shook his head. You remember wrong. Lydia turned then, studying his face the way a traveler studies distant landmarks. Do you remember a wagon train stranded near the northern pass 12 years ago? Coulter said nothing. The drifts buried the road for weeks, she continued softly. People were freezing. My father died first, then the others began leaving, hopping to find help. Her voice remained calm, though grief moved beneath the surface like slow water. I stayed behind because my leg was injured. By the third night, I thought the cold would take me. Coulter's eyes darkened. But a trapper came out of the storm, Lydia said, a man who didn't ask questions. He built fires and brought meat and stayed until the snow eased. She stepped closer. That man had a scar here. Her finger hovered in the air near his ribs. Coulter turned slightly, the motion instinctive. You've got a sharp memory, he said. I had a good teacher. The fire cracked softly in the hearth. For a while neither of them spoke. Then Coulter sighed, the sound rough with old memories. Even if you're right, that was a long time ago. Gratitude fades with distance. Not mine. She placed the compass carefully on the table between them. I searched 3 states trying to find the mountain man who carried me through that winter. Coulter studied the small instrument, its needle trembling north. Why? Because some kindness changes the direction of a life. The simple truth of it settled over the room. Outside, the wind thickened, pushing snow against the cabin walls. Coulter finally moved toward the hearth and added another log. Storm's coming down hard, he said. Trail won't be safe until morning. Lydia nodded, unsurprised. Then I'll stay. The decision seemed natural, as if the mountain itself had made it for them. Hours passed quietly. Coulter cooked venison in a cast iron pan, while Lydia warmed bread beside the fire. They spoke little, yet the silence no longer felt heavy. Snow tapped softly against the windows. At one point Lydia laughed, soft and unexpected, when the kettle rattled too loudly on its hook. The sound startled Coulter. He realized it had been years since laughter had filled this cabin. Later she helped mend a torn blanket while he sharpened a hunting knife. Their hands worked in companionable rhythm. Something subtle shifted in the room. Not comfort exactly, but the beginning of it. Near midnight the storm howled fiercely outside. Wind battered the roof like waves against a ship. Lydia sat close to the fire, rubbing warmth back into her fingers. You've lived alone here a long time, she said. Long enough. Doesn't it get lonely? Coulter poked the fire with a stick. Lonely is easier than losing people. The words slipped out before he could stop them. Lydia studied him quietly. You lost someone. Everyone out here loses someone. That wasn't the question. Coulter stared into the flames. Once he admitted, long ago. He did not say her name. The firelight reflected in Lydia's eyes. I'm sorry. He shrugged. Mountains teach a man how to keep walking. Another silence settled over them. But this one felt warmer. Morning arrived slowly. The storm faded to gentle snowfall, drifting through pale sunlight. Coulter stepped outside first, surveying the deep drifts covering the clearing. The trail would be nearly impossible to ride today. When he returned inside, Lydia was already preparing coffee. "You can stay until the road clears," he said. Her smile was small but bright. "Thank you." Days slipped by after that. Snow kept the mountain locked in quiet stillness. Travel became impossible, and the world shrank to the circle of trees surrounding the cabin. Yet something gentle grew within that circle. They shared chores without discussion. Coulter showed her how to set rabbit snares along the ridge. Lydia proved surprisingly steady with the work, her movements patient and careful. In the evenings, they cooked together beside the fire. She spoke of towns she had passed through during her search, of rivers crossed and long dusty roads. Coulter listened more than he talked. But sometimes he answered. Little pieces of himself surfaced, stories about harsh winters, about hunting elk in the high valleys, about nights when the northern lights painted the sky green like ghost fire. Lydia listened the way people listen to music. One afternoon she slipped while hauling water from the creek. Coulter caught her arm before she hit the ice. For a moment they stood close, breath mingling in the cold air. Neither moved. Then Lydia gently pulled away. "Thank you," she said. Coulter watched her walk back toward the cabin. The mountains had been silent companions for years. Now every quiet moment seemed to echo differently. That evening Lydia sat near the window, while snow drifted lazily outside. "There's something I haven't told you yet," she said. Coulter leaned back in his chair. "Go on. When you left that wagon camp years ago, I thought I would never see you again, but before you disappeared into the storm, you said something." Coulter frowned faintly. "Did I? You told me kindness was easier than regret." The words stirred a distant memory. Lydia folded her hands together. "I held on to that sentence every year since." Coulter's chest tightened unexpectedly. "You built a long journey from a simple piece of advice." "Maybe." Her gaze met his. "Or maybe I built it from hope." The fire burned low between them. Outside, the snow finally stopped falling. Stars began appearing in the darkening sky. For the first time in years, Coulter felt uncertain inside his own home. Hope could be a dangerous thing in the mountains, especially when it knocked softly at the door of a heart that had been closed for decades. Lydia stood and placed another log on the fire. Then she turned toward him, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't come all this way just to thank you." Coulter felt the weight of those words settle into the quiet cabin. He waited, but Lydia did not explain further. Instead, she looked toward the door where the night stretched beyond the trees. And after a long moment, she said softly, almost to herself, "I came because some people save your life once, and you spend the rest of your life wondering if they might save your heart too." Morning crept slowly over the mountains, pale and uncertain, like a lantern being lifted through fog. The storm had finally loosened its grip on the valley, leaving the world buried beneath a silent ocean of snow. Pine branches sagged under the weight of white drifts, and the frozen creek whispered beneath its thin glass of ice. Inside the cabin, the fire had burned down to quiet embers. Coulter Briggs sat awake beside the hearth, elbows resting on his knees, staring into the last faint glow of coals. He had not slept. Lydia's words from the night before moved through his mind like wind across a frozen lake, stirring old fears he had buried beneath years of solitude. Some people save your life once, and you spend the rest of your life wondering if they might save your heart too. Coulter had spent 2 decades believing his heart was something the mountains had taken in exchange for survival. Out here, a man learned quickly that attachment could be as dangerous as winter itself. Love made promises the wilderness had no interest in keeping. Yet the cabin felt different now, warmer, alive in ways he had almost forgot. Behind him, Lydia stirred beneath the blanket on the small bed. The soft rustle of wool broke the morning quiet. She sat up slowly, brushing loose hair from her face. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Pale sunlight filtered through the frost-coated window, casting delicate patterns across the wooden floor. The storm is gone, Lydia said gently. Coulter nodded. Trail will be clearer today. She understood what he meant without him saying it. The road back to town was open again. Her search had reached its end. Lydia rose and folded the blanket with careful hands. There was no sadness in her movements, only a quiet acceptance that carried more weight than tears. You've been kind to let me stay, she said. Coulter stood and added a log to the dying fire. Kindness is easier than regret, he murmured. She gave a faint smile at the familiar phrase. Outside, the sky had cleared into a deep winter blue. Sunlight shimmered across the snow like scattered diamonds. The world looked untouched, as if no storm had ever passed through. They saddled their horses without speaking much. Lydia's satchel rested lightly against the saddle horn, the old compass tucked safely inside. Coulter tightened the final strap and stepped back. The ride down will take half the day, he said. Lydia mounted her horse. Then I suppose we should start. They followed the narrow trail through the forest, snow crunching beneath steady hooves. The mountains watched silently from every side, their white peaks glowing beneath the rising sun. For a long while they rode without conversation. Yet something fragile hung in the air between them, like a word neither of them had found the courage to say. The trees eventually thinned, revealing the wide valley below. Smoke curled lazily from the chimneys of ridge. Lydia slowed her horse. This is where our roads separate, she said softly. Coulter knew she was right. Town lay ahead, and beyond it the long routes leading south and east. Places where young people built lives together. Places where a woman like Lydia belonged. He stared across the valley, feeling a strange heaviness in his chest. You'll find easier winters down there, he said. Maybe. She looked at him with quiet patience. But easier isn't always better. Coulter said nothing. They reached the edge of town by midday. The wooden buildings stood quiet under fresh snow. A few townsfolk glanced up as the riders approached, curiosity flickering across their faces. Old Jasper Pike leaned on his porch again, pipe clamped between his teeth. Well, I'll be, he muttered when he saw Lydia riding beside Coulter. Looks like the mountains been keeping company after all. Coulter dismounted and helped Lydia down without thinking. Their hands brushed briefly. The touch lingered longer than it should have. Marshal Grant stepped out of the sheriff's office, his sharp eyes studying the pair. Miss, he said, folks were wondering if you'd frozen up there. Lydia shook her head. Not this time. The marshal's gaze shifted to Coulter. Didn't expect you to play host, Briggs. Coulter shrugged. Storm makes strangers of us all. Grunted but said nothing further. Lydia collected her satchel and turned toward the south road. The moment had arrived, quiet and inevitable. Thank you for the shelter, she said to Coulter. He nodded once. Safe travels. For a heartbeat she hesitated, as if waiting for something more, but when no other words came, she stepped away. Her horse carried her slowly toward the far end of town. Coulter watched until she reached the bend in the road, where the valley trail disappeared between two hills. Then she was gone. The town resumed its ordinary sounds around him, boots against snow, wagon wheels creaking, distant laughter from the saloon. Yet everything felt strangely hollow. Old Jasper shuffled closer. You planning to stand there all afternoon, son? Coulter rubbed a hand across his beard. Just thinking. The old man studied him carefully. Dangerous habit. Coulter exhaled slowly. She came a long way for a memory. Jasper tapped his pipe against the railing. Maybe she came for more than that. Coulter said nothing. The wind drifted through town, carrying the faint scent of pine. Jasper leaned closer, lowering his voice. Let me tell you something about mountains, Briggs. They're old, stubborn things, but even they change when the seasons push hard enough. Coulter frowned slightly. What's that supposed to mean? Means you're not as carved in stone as you pretend. The words lingered after the old man hobbled away. Coulter mounted his horse again, intending to ride back toward the high cabin. The trail up the mountain waited, just as it always had. but when he turned toward it, something inside him resisted. The road looked colder now, lonelier. He realized something unsettling. The mountains had never truly been silent before. Lydia's presence had filled the quiet with warmth he had forgotten how to live without. He sat there for several long seconds. Then he pulled the reins sharply. The horse wheeled around. Snow sprayed beneath its hooves as Coulter spurred it toward the southern trail. Wind rushed past his ears as the town vanished behind him. The valley road stretched ahead, winding through hills and frozen streams. If Lydia kept a steady pace, she would reach the old ranger cabin by nightfall. But winter roads held dangers, and regret traveled faster than fear. Coulter rode hard. The sky darkened slowly as afternoon faded into evening. Clouds rolled across the peaks again, though no new storm followed. The ranger cabin finally appeared near sunset, half buried in snow beside a line of bare cottonwoods. A thin thread of smoke curled from its chimney. Coulter slowed his horse. Light glowed faintly through the frosted window. He dismounted and approached the door, his heartbeat strangely unsteady. Inside, Lydia sat beside the small hearth, warming her hands over the fire. She looked up when the door creaked open. Surprise flickered across her face. Coulter. For a moment, neither of them moved. The cabin smelled of burning pine and melting snow. "I thought you'd be halfway home by now," she said. Coulter closed the door behind him. "Couldn't make the trail." Her brow furrowed slightly. "Too much snow." "No." He removed his hat slowly, turning it in his hands. "Too many things left unsaid." Lydia stood. Coulter searched for the right words, but the years had left his heart clumsy with language. Finally, he spoke plainly. "You asked once if the mountains ever felt lonely." She waited quietly. "Truth is, they didn't. Until you came." Her breath caught softly. Coulter stepped closer. "I told myself I was too old for love, told myself the mountains had already taken that part of me." His voice grew steadier with each word. "But watching you ride away today felt worse than any winter I've survived." Lydia's eyes shone in the firelight. Coulter continued. "Maybe my heart isn't dead. Maybe it's just been hiding up there in the snow." He took another step forward. "And maybe the only person who ever knew where to find it is you." Silence filled the little cabin. Then Lydia smiled slowly, warmth spreading across her face like sunrise over frozen peaks. "You rode all this way just to say that." Coulter nodded once. "Seems a man should chase after the things he nearly loses." She reached out, taking his rough hand in hers. The contact felt simple, natural, as if it had always been meant to happen. "For years I wondered if the man who saved me even remembered that winter," she said softly. Coulter squeezed her hand. "I remember it now." Outside, the first stars began appearing above the dark mountains. Inside the ranger cabin, the fire crackled warmly as Lydia stepped closer and rested her forehead gently against his. And for the first time in 20 long winters, Coulter Briggs realized the mountains were not the oldest thing in the world. A guarded heart could be older still. But when it finally opened, it felt bigger than the sky.